When you're in Chicago, you might not notice it, but there's one thing that an uncanny number of older and even newer skyscrapers share. Do you see it? It's right there. And there. It's the windows. I don't mean that they have windows. I mean, of course they do. I mean that they share their window design. And this is a special window that's identified by its three parts. The part in the middle is usually a little bit larger than the other two. While this pane of glass will vary in size from building to building, it's usually about as big as it can be, based on a few different factors that we'll discuss. Its large size also means that it can't open. It's usually too big and heavy. And to give it an opening mechanism would just cut into the amount of light that it would be able to come in. That's where the other two parts come important. They flank the larger pane in the middle and are usually sash windows that slide up and down. When these are open, they allow fresh air and breezes to flow through the building.
Tore open the shutters and threw up the sash.
So one window is strictly for light, and then the other two are for both light and air. This three-part window design maybe doesn't seem that special. Palladian windows, for instance, look pretty similar. They came way before the Chicago version. It also has three parts, but with an arch over the middle part. And it was André Palladio's, the Renaissance architect's, interpretation of a classical Greek and Roman forms. This kind here, though, distinguishes the middle part through width, not added height. And while it might seem like a minor set of distinctions that make this type of window special, it does have a name. It's called the Chicago window, and it's been associated with Chicago architecture for the past 150 years.
Here we have a classic Chicago window, I guess you could say. The only difference is that rather than having one big light of polished plate glass, we have these two lights with a mullion in between, and then we have operable sash at either end. And this is what made the Chicago window. Big open light in the middle, a fixed glass, and then operable sash.
It initially developed as a clever response to some challenging conditions that came from the economic pressure to build more office space in the city. And while the steel frame is often credited as the invention that made it possible to stack more offices on top of one another into a skyscraper, some argue that it's actually the Chicago window that had a much more significance in making this a viable and a popular way to build. It's because building height and its size is determined by more factors than just structural capacity and material forces and things like that. Obvious ones are the ability to reach the floors with an elevator, pressurized plumbing, which allows water to get up there, but one of the most important factors is access to light and air, a requirement for spaces at all levels of a building. Early skyscrapers didn't have electricity. They came before that was possible, so gas lamps were a common way to light the interior. This was dangerous both by introducing open flames and flammable gas, as well as by compromising indoor air quality. So large Chicago windows found the delicate balance of allowing in the most light to work with and air to clear out that noxious gases.
And it's a really exciting time when there's a lot of innovation going on. But basically they were reducing the building element, the exterior facade, to what the absolute minimum was, to have the steel enclosed, and then the rest of it could be glass. And the Chicago window worked perfectly for that because you had a big piece of polished plate glass, and then the operable sash allowed it for the natural ventilation, and it worked quite well.
Light and air for a building is obviously regulated by the facade membrane, and when you build with a structure made of gridded steel, there's a remaining question of what to do with this membrane. That's because it isn't technically part of the structural system. The steel frame is a standalone piece that doesn't really need a facade in order to stand up. It does just fine on its own. You basically have three choices here. Which choice the architect makes yields windows that have a varying relationship to that steel frame. First, you might design a facade that holds itself up. This might be made of stone or brick. This solution severely limits the size of a window because the more windows you make, the less structurally sound the facade becomes. That's how Louis Sullivan's auditorium building is designed. These usually only have 1 or 2 panes because the width is limited. The second option is to push the facade into the frame by infilling the space of the grid with separate panels. A good example of this might be the first lighter building by William LeBron Jenney in 1879. There's no real performative downside to this, but it limits the options for ornament and other exterior facing options. The third option is to hang the facade off of the frame in a non-structural way, creating a sort of curtain out of it. This solution offers a lot of freedom with what you can do with the facade and the size and the shape of the windows. While it seems logical that the structural base size would be the limiting factor for how big a window could actually be, it's not actually the only factor. And this is actually a case where bigger is better, because bigger windows meant that you could build bigger buildings. But glass manufacturing during this time was relatively crude compared to what it is today. It was very expensive to make since it was made by hand. You could either spin it into a giant disc that was cut into rectangular window shapes, or you could blow it into the shape of a cylinder, splice it, and flatten it out. Either way, it was a labor-intensive, expensive process that yielded wavy sheets of glass that were limited in size. If a sheet was cut close to the base of a disc, it might be thicker at the bottom. It could be ground down by hand, but of course that introduces even more cost and time.
The reason why these Chicago windows were able to be made when they were was because of the improvements in technology that allowed them to make polished plate glass. But the polished plate, that was a process that was took a lot of time. First they had to melt the glass, and they had it in huge pots. They dumped it out on a giant table, and then a giant roller, like making a pie crust, would come, and it would level it out to a certain thickness. And then they would cut that up into various sizes, and then they would put it on another, like a assembly line process, and it would go through a series of grinders, basically, that would grind it down, and getting finer and finer and finer until you got polished plate glass at the end. And it was over a length of a football field or whatever. There were huge plants.
As the perfect strip emerges, only the problem of handling governs its length.
Right around the 1890s, you have a confluence of a few developments which shifted the game. First is electrification. When artificial light can replace natural, it is less important for large windows to be located near every single office. This lessened the need for the largest windows possible. This was offset, though, by the second development, which is the availability of cheaper plate glass. A large pocket of underground natural gas was found in Indiana, making more glass production facilities possible. At the confluence of all these factors, the Chicago window found the perfect balance between them, and thus they made their way into countless buildings across Chicago. My favorite is the Reliance Building, with its extraordinarily light facade.
The upper floors, it was doctors and dentists, and they wanted to be able to, if you're going to pull somebody's tooth, you want to make sure you're getting the right one. And so it wasn't always easy to see, and having that maximum amount of glass was really key.
But I think the most quintessential version is here at the Marquette Building, completed in 1895 and designed by the architecture firm Halliburton Roche. It's also the home of Harbeau architects.
For the last 30 years, I've been working on restoring buildings, and in being in Chicago, of course, you get to work on some of those wonderful first period skyscrapers. And this is one of the best examples of the first Chicago school, where the structure is really expressed. You have these clear, big openings, and it has this lovely brown, earthy color of the terracotta that is very expressive of what was thought to be the aesthetic of the time.
Looking at it, it's also apparent that we don't usually find the Chicago window on the first floor. Rather, it's reserved for the offices above. The first floor doesn't usually have operable windows. The street is just too loud and would have been too smelly to ever want to open them. The first floor of this building also features an incredible mural made of mosaic glass by Louis Comfort Timpany. While the building seems quite large from the street, at 16-story tall and presenting an unbroken wall to Dearborn Avenue, it has a quite unique plan that ensures that no offices are without their very own Chicago window.
This building is actually like a C-shaped building. They would open the windows here, and then there was also windows in the corridor. There was, borrowed light, if you will, in the corridors, typically. And they would open those sash, the transoms in most cases, and then they would get air moving through the building, which, of course, when there was no air conditioning was really important because it did get hot.
It's also an example where the facade hangs off of the steel frame. The exterior is made of textured terracotta tiles, which is relatively lightweight. The effect creates a cloth-like woven pattern punctured evenly with those glorious windows. The building has had a long life, and by the 2000s it was a little worse for wear. The top had been removed and its windows were needing replacement. Harbeau architects led the building's restoration.
When these were all restored, did make the decision to not go with insulated glass, to keep the original glass wherever we could. If you put your hand against here, you can feel that it's colder than it would be if it was an insulated glass.
There's even a display on the first floor that chronicles the building's restoration. Over time, the window has become ingrained into Chicago architecture and its tall buildings. It's part of what makes this place unique. And when architects design buildings for a place that has unique vernacular elements, they often try to incorporate some of those elements. This might be so that the building fits into the context, or at least complements it, or has a dialogue with buildings nearby. Many notable buildings have incorporated Chicago windows in their design even after they were no longer functionally necessary. For instance, the great competition in 1922 to design the Chicago Tribune Tower, the famous German modern architect Walter Gropius submitted a scheme that many might call an international-style skyscraper. And at first glance, in large part due to the lack of ornament, maybe it looks like the building could belong anywhere. But Gropius did include 3-part Chicago windows lining the tower on all sides. And Chicago architects like Harry Weiss built a number of buildings with variants of the Chicago window, usually in bays where the 2 sidelights protrude from the building. So next time you're in Chicago, take a look around to notice the windows. Can you find some Chicago windows lurking either for functional or even just aesthetic or historical reasons? Or even if you're not in Chicago, is there a particular kind of window unique to that place? Man, I absolutely loved chatting with Gunny Harboe about Chicago windows. We talked about a lot more. He's worked on almost every incredible historical building in the city of Chicago. He is a wealth of knowledge and of history. We ended up chatting for over an hour and learned all kinds of anecdotes like how he solved the problem of replacing the glass in IIT's Crown Hall by Mies van der Rohe. Unfortunately, I was only able to use a few of those snippets in this video, so I created an entirely new video, an extended cut if you will, of the rest of the interview. It's exclusively uploaded on the streaming service Nebula, which if you didn't know already is a little something that I've been working on with a lot of your other favorite creators here on YouTube. It's where I and channels like Johnny Harris, Not Just Bikes, and City Beautiful, and dozens more upload our regular YouTube videos early, and we share videos where we experiment with topics and techniques that aren't strangled by the YouTube algorithm. There are thousands of those videos, and they're all completely ad-free. Nebula also features exclusive courses, originals, and game shows like Jet Lag, so click on the link in the description and watch that interview with Gunny. Sign up for Nebula, and you'll unlock access to secret treasures of your favorite YouTube creators, and you'll be supporting me to be able to continue making content like this one, which explores the depths of the built environment. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and maybe a comment. I love engaging in the conversation. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that, and you'll be rewarded with videos in the built environment just like this one every other Thursday. While you're waiting, check out some of these others. See you over there.